Good morning and welcome to Hope, Faith, and Joy Daily Devotion with me, Pastor Amanda. Today we are looking at chapter 49 of Genesis. Can you believe it? We're at tomorrow, Friday, we'll be at chapter 50. We'll have completed Genesis by tomorrow. But anyways, just a little kind of devotion about today, or maybe more just information. Chapter 49 is Jacob's blessing, or curse almost, for some of his sons, to all of them. And what we find here is there's a bit of some prophetic speaking in this chapter. There's a little bit of just historical knowledge of what actually happened to some of these tribes. And then there's a little bit of one-on-one controversy that happens in this chapter. So it's a little mixed up, but we go through each of Jacob's sons as to what they shall inherit or experience, or what their future is. But there's a few interesting things that happen along the way. And so what we find out is that Reuben is the first one acknowledged as the first son. However, that due to his bad behavior of sleeping with one of Jacob's wives, his firstborn inheritance will be taken away from him, and that he is kind of cast out, so to speak, of the inheritance. Also, Simeon and Levi are also kind of put aside due to the violence that they had shown in some of the murders they had created because of their anger. So it is to say, in verse 7, it says, "Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel." So then we get to Judah, which is kind of interesting, because if we remember, Judah is the one with Tamar. So he didn't give his sons to Tamar, and then she ends up sleeping with him to bear a child from him. So we have him. But he kind of goes from a low position in the family to he kind of raises up to be the one. He is the inheritor, really, of the inheritance, because Judah, the land of Judah, will actually be the place where all of the kings come out of. So really, Judah ends up being the first who receives the blessing of kingship will come out of Judah. And so we see that despite his bad behavior, he kind of came up the ranks for how he sacrificed his life for Benjamin. But the other brothers, downhill, no cool. And so after Judah, we hear just a little bit about Zebulun, Issachar, Dan, and Gad, Asher, and then we have this kind of beautiful recognition of Joseph. I mean, Joseph is the fruitful bough, a fruitful bough by a spring. His branches run over the wall. And so we see all this blessing. Though Jacob recognizes that Joseph will encounter some hardships along the way, but he will overcome because God is with him and it'll all work out. And then, of course, just a little something about Benjamin at the very end. And that's the blessing upon them. And what I kind of get out of this is just family dynamics and how you can see that, what can all happen in a family. But what happens overall in this family, despite the fighting, despite what happened bad, God's going to do something amazing out of all of it. God's goodness, God's promise is going to prevail despite everything else that's happening in this family. And that's good to know. It's good to know that God prevails in all these situations. And then what also shows that Jacob is aware of God's promises is that he asked to be buried with his ancestors, technically. He wants to be buried in the cave where Abraham and Sarah were buried, where Isaac and Rebekah were buried. He's going to actually be buried where Leah is buried. Even though he has his favorite wife, Rachel, he recognizes kind of the promises that God has and how that works out. And so he's wanting to stay part of that. And so he asked for his burial to be with his family. And so we see all these ties and these push and pulls and everything in the life. But it's now being passed on to the next generation. And it's his kind of letting go of letting God. Letting go to let God. I love that little saying. And so that's where we end up today with today's short devotion, to see where is God, where are the blessings, knowing that in the midst of it there's curses and all sorts of other stuff, but God's blessing does prevail, and God's promises continue to work through the generations. It doesn't stop with a generation. It continues to work through the generations. And that can give us hope to keep on going each day in the midst of everything that's going on. So, thanks for joining me today for today's devotion, and I'll see you tomorrow.